Keine
Okay.
Angst. Gut, wir sind live jetzt auf YouTube.
Yeah.
Sorry, we are live. We're in English. Hi, Kathrin.
Which
We switched to English.
you
Exactly.
remembered
I remember what?
that we have to switch to English.
Yeah, I do, of course. Yeah.
Hi, Pascal.
Hi, Kathrin. I have to switch off the sound, otherwise I can hear myself from the YouTube live.
Yeah, it's not really great.
No, I can't hear you anymore. Now, we're ready, I think. Are you ready, Kathrin?
I am.
Perfect. Good. Welcome, everybody. We're here for the Piece of the Paddle podcast with Kathrin and myself. So, this is the first episode called Scaling Mediation, Different Levels, Same Tools. We will discuss about the opportunities and possibilities to apply different, same tools on different levels of mediation. About techniques and role of the mediator, and is this all the same even if we work on different levels with group conflicts and peace mediation, local mediation. And we will elaborate all this together with you, we hope. So this is an interactive podcast. We really invite you to leave your comments and questions and remarks in the chat. There is the chat on the right side of your YouTube. And you can leave comments, remarks. You can even, small hearts and things that you can activate if you like the discussion. Thumbs ups, exactly. And yeah, please like the channel and subscribe and interact. That will help us. You can also suggest other topics for other episodes. So we try to do this every second week. We'll see how much we manage, but that's our intention. For about, we'll see, 45 minutes, a bit longer, a bit shorter. Depends a bit on how it goes. So now for today, Kathrin, what are the guiding questions for today? What's our motivation?
Actually, just let me add, Pascal, I think that just to add that the format that it's us, but we also have a few episodes where we would like to have guests invited, just to give you the heads up on that too.
Exactly.
Yeah, for today, welcome from my side of the world as well. Good morning from my side of the world. I think for today, we have this really interesting thought about a topic that is, I think the guiding question for us was, can we take what we learn from in a classical mediation setting or in a classical mediation education into the world of peace building and into peace mediation?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the question was triggered because the education and the professionalization around peace mediation is rather new, and there's very little evidence around what really works in terms of mediation techniques and tools in peace mediation. The thing for us, the guiding question is exactly that. It's like, are all principles and tools and techniques that we learn from mediation transferable into a peace mediation setting? I think that was what we thought about for ourselves and really want to discuss, and hope you also have questions around it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Pascal, do we have, we start with the definition, right?
Yeah. What is mediation?
Are you asking me? Yeah, so I think also that's interesting to say that, for example, when we look at peace mediation, there isn't a one and only definition. So there isn't a commonly defined definition, but the UN really sees it as a voluntary process where two or more parties come to the table to resolve, manage, or prevent a conflict with the help of an impartial third party. And the role of the third party is to help develop the process and guide with the content as well. So that's a little bit the definition, I think, from the UN's perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And I think with this, we're already in the center of the topic. Just a short example, when we submitted a project for for what we call the mediation. It was in the company community field, company community mediation, and we submitted a proposal. And the funding agency, the person in charge of our proposal, was himself an experienced mediator, and he actually told us, no, don't call it mediation, call it dialogue. Because, and he was very, very right. It was really a very good remark, because with mediation, you generate expectations, which you don't, or let's say much less if you call it a dialogue. So mediation, sometimes you might be doing a mediation, but call it differently, or the other way around. So
Definitely. And I think in particular on an international level, politically speaking, it can be much harder to say in a formally mediating process, because you are also more accountable to it, I think. So definitely that's a really, really good point.
And probably if you use the strict, then I don't know, the different countries might have different regulations, but I sit in Switzerland, and so the deontology would not allow you, for instance, to make proposals, which I think in a larger scale, you quite often, or let's say you drop ideas at least, if not proposals. So in a strict understanding of local mediations, you cannot do that.
By the way, I think that should be another podcast topic, because there's very different traditions in that. What you say is like this more transformative approach to mediation, where you really want the parties to develop their own solutions, because it triggers another process, I think, for the solution of the problem. And then there's a different school that really, as you say, drops suggestions, or even really very willingly talks about other examples and takes other examples where things have worked or not. I think on an international level that is often done as well, right? That you look towards some of the more successful agreements and see what was the process, what was the setup, etc. So I think that's maybe, because if we enter the topic now, I think we may get over time, but I think that could be really an interesting topic to explore too.
We will have plenty of topics to cover in the following episodes. And again, please comment and propose topics if you have some. We have plenty, but maybe you have other ideas that we also might find of interest. Yeah, but let's start maybe with the classical dimension, like the typical role of the mediator. What would you say between the different levels? Is it the same role?
I think the framework, sort of the basis, stays the same, definitely. The mediator, the key role is to help the parties come to a solution. So developing the process together with them, bringing them together to the table or not, like speaking to them separately depending on the context. So it's really a focus on the process. And I think a really important aspect is building trust. And I think that is also an aspect that plays a huge role in peace mediation, of course, that yes, the process work as well, but the responsibility to build trust is particularly important in peace mediation, where conflicts can be really, really complex and complicated to examine.
So we could maybe say the main principles, like what you said, ownership, I guess also to some extent neutrality, whereas international level, it's a bit more complicated than that. Building trust. So all maybe the basic principles of mediation are the same, could we say, or at least very, very similar.
I think they are, and I think you should give us a bit more, also some thoughts, from your own perspective. But I think because of the complexity of conflicts in an international setting, I think that the key principles are even more important in a way, right? Confidentiality is a huge topic, and we have, I think, several examples where this was really challenging. I remember the peace conversations that led to the Good Friday Agreement, when conversations and dialogue was going on, but there were still bombs going off, and had the public known that there was a conversation behind closed doors, it could have derailed the whole process. So I think confidentiality is a huge topic, but also on the flip side, as we've seen in Colombia, at some point, the public or sort of the people that are concerned by the conflict need to be in the loop of what's going on. And that has to be balanced as well. So there is, to some extent, you also need to build legitimacy of the process.
Yeah.
That can only happen through sharing some of the conversation and the topics and the process that's going on. So it's a really, really tricky line. And of course, that layer you don't have in a private sort of classical setting, not at all. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
From your experience, I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I could add another example. You mentioned the Good Friday Agreement with the confidentiality. That was also similar with the Oslo process, where the Israeli and Palestinian side did not actually recognize each other. So how can you say publicly we're negotiating with somebody that you don't even recognize? So that's why, as I understood it, that's why they started in a very secret, very confidential setting first before it went more public. Yeah, the role, I see it the same way. So the basic principles, the rule, the ethics are very similar. Then the role, I would say the broader it is, the more you deal with groups, the more people you have involved, you become maybe more of maybe a strange word to use, but of a project manager, in addition to being a mediator, because you have so many things to manage. I mean, in a small scale, the process is really straight, very clear. You have the typical 5 phases model or whichever. There are some different models, but very easy, very linear, very simple. But in more complex situations, you have the constituency groups to manage. You have maybe the media to manage. You have various topics, you have so many more things to manage. So I think you're much more, on one hand, a project manager. Again, I don't know what you think about this term. In addition to being mediator, you're also a project manager and a crisis manager, and also probably more of a negotiator than a mediator, if that makes sense to you, in a sense that you're more, you try to make a deal rather than having some very transformative emotional individual change. You have that as well, but it's and the last point, maybe the design. I mentioned the design, the process, and this is obviously very different to my experience. Even with if you have a couple of groups involved, you have different channels. Obviously, you have different. The design becomes much more important in a small scale mediation. Having the right question at the right moment has a huge relevance. In a bigger setting, I think that's less the case. But what is much more important is having the right process, having the right design. Who is meeting whom at what time? Who can you put together or not? The whole sequencing questions become much more important.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the design question you ask, definitely, it becomes so complex. And I would agree. I mean, project manager for sure. And also people manager in a way, because mediators, if we look at really track 1, by the way, we should mention the different tracks. If we look at sort of very high level peace mediation processes, the mediator has a huge team actually that he or she also needs to manage. And
Absolutely.
It's interesting because in a small setting, the mediator is the person who is sort of trying to identify the different interests of the parties, going beyond their positions, etc. And then on a more like on the international scale, you have a whole team and you have experts, right? You would have a gender advisor that really looks at how does the conflict impact women? How can they be integrated into the conflict resolution process? What are some of the gender issues we would need to cover in a
security arrangements? Yeah.
So you can tap into different expertise. But as we mentioned, tracks in terms of the process and design, sort of on an international level, often we look at 3 tracks. Track 1, which is grassroots. Track 2, which is more sort of a political elite level. And then track 2, which is really sort of the high-level government representatives. There's also track 1.5 in the meantime. So I think there's different definitions, but it clearly shows, I think, the complexity of a peace mediation process and the different levels it requires to build actually, or to come to a potential solution.
And that's where maybe then a little bit beyond the pure negotiation or mediation process, you know, you also have the Laderache gaps, the interdependency gap, as you called it, where you have those different levels, track 1, track 2, and track 3, and they don't interact. So you have maybe a high-level negotiation with state officials, then you have some academia, parliamentarian, you know, track 2, and then grassroots. But if those levels don't interact, each level might be in itself a good process, a well-done mediation. But if they don't interact, you're missing out on the big part. You know, what needs the constituency? What is, you know, because that's why in very often in peace deals, people don't feel or don't see the peace because where is the peace dividend? Okay, you have a deal, you got nice pictures in a nice hotel, but where can I see the peace? You know, what's my benefit? What's my peace dividend? So
yeah, definitely.
We have a question from Isabel Turner. She asks, could you speak to how neutrality or the ethics of neutrality functions in situations where atrocities have been committed by one or both sides?
That's a really good question. I think I wanted to say something else on the role, but it skipped my mind. It may have been. It may come back.
We'll come back.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, atrocities. How can we be? I think, as I understand it, she asks, how can I think neutrality of the mediator, obviously, ethics of neutrality. I was in a conference not a long time ago in a panel, and exactly this question was asked as well. Yeah. Please,
I think from just that's maybe one we could start looking at sort of the framework around the mediation, because clearly, like on a peace mediation level, you would be bound by international law, and so humanitarian international principles. The mediator has to adhere to it, which is, of course, I mean, you don't have the similar questions in a private mediation setting. So that is sort of, I think, the first very clear guideline for a mediator. But I think on a personal level, you know, how do you as a mediator encounter parties that have committed atrocities? It opens up a whole other box of questions. And I can maybe speak about my own experience, not so much my own, but mine and a colleague. I remember very clearly a family mediation situation that I was in, and where I had a hard time staying really impartial with both sides. And the reason was that it was around a divorce, and the conflict was really, really quite intrinsic, and it became nasty, and the things both sides said about each other were really very, very mean and unpleasant and hard to resolve. And I remember clearly a moment when the man in the conflict made a comment about how his wife would always take her job more. She would find her job more importantly than the kids, and made a lot of comments around that. And I, having just come back after having given birth to my children to work and work with them, I really had a hard time not judging him for making comments around, for being very conservative, etc. So just to say, so it was a tough exercise to really stay impartial and accept him in the process as much as I did the other side. Now take this on another level. I was in a training together with a colleague who has done a lot of humanitarian negotiation and mediations. And he has told me that he was coming to a mediation one time in the morning in a small village, and sitting together on a table with a group of people who were, he was pretty sure, and everybody was pretty sure, they had committed, you know, just couple days before, rape and other atrocities during the conflict. And I think that really clearly shows, one thing is to accept sort of conservative views that you don't align with. And then the other is being able to accept the person coming to the table as the person, as a human, despite the fact what he or she did. And I think that is an absolute essence for mediation, because you have to be able to speak to all people on the party, whether you
Absolutely.
What happens afterwards is another story, right? But I think this being open still to listen and really genuinely listen, that is absolutely essential.
Yeah, you have to keep a distance as a mediator. I think this is an extremely important dimension or capacity of a mediator. I would add 2 points. One is, and it might be very hard to hear for people who are concerned, who suffered from such violations and atrocities. But from a mediator's point of view, one way to keep your distance is we're looking to the future, not to the past. Of course, to some extent, the past is why we're here. But the idea is not to find responsibilities in the past, or the idea is how are we going to do this for the future? How are we going to live together in the future? This is the main approach. Of course, the past can be extremely present, but in our setting, it's about the future, at least in my perception. And the other thing is, it's very much connected to what I just said, but it's a very philosophical question. What is our vision of the human nature? And we have, I don't know in English exactly how you say this, but the man is the wolf of the man, or something like this must be in English. The idea of saying that human nature is bad. The human is bad by nature, so you have to put laws, you have to control the pulsions, they have to put the humans in some framework. And the other one, which would be more Rousseau, although I'm not a philosopher, please feel free to correct me. But Rousseau, who says the opposite, who says, no, actually, the human is good by nature, but corrupted by society. And personally, I'm convinced by Rousseau's approach. So the human is good by nature, and whatever happened, we have to dig out that good part of the human nature. And if we don't believe that every human can be good and was just corrupted by society, even again, it can be very hard to hear from people who suffered from atrocities, but I believe in that, and that helps me to keep distance. I had such a rape situation as well once. There was a B2B company mediation where also on one side there was such a situation. And I remember very well that almost never happens to me, so I can really good keep distance from what happens in the office during the day and when I come home. But at that time, because the girl was raped at about the age of my first daughter, so when I came home and she ran to me when I came into the door, I said, "Wow, what a yeah." But then in another meeting when he came, he told me, "Well, actually, I became father of a girl recently." And I said very spontaneously, "Oh, congratulations." And he started crying. And I said, "What happens?" And he said, "You're probably one of the first, foreigner or person that I don't know, apart from very close family, that congratulates, because people think that I would be a bad father for a girl as a I don't know if I can say rapist or whatever the good term is." So, but because I took distance, the facts were way back, years back. So I think probably it's another person, and he was convicted, and for me it's past.
Yeah. But I think this is interesting that you say that, because it also shows sort of what we do, right? In mediation is like one of the first principles you learn is you detach the person from the situation. And I think that is super important to remind yourself. And I think we all have the tendency, we experience a situation, I don't know, outside somewhere in the tram, we see somebody speaking like very unfriendly, and then we make a judgment about the person, and it's it's the situation, we don't know anything about the person. So I think it really shows the example also that you gave. But I don't know, Isabel, whether it answered your question, but to me, it's one of the most tricky and complicated questions for sure. And maybe just one thing to add, because we haven't given that a lot of thought in mediation as a sort of an education as well and a profession. It's the importance of emotional intelligence. So we speak a lot about the different tools and techniques that one needs. On an international level, we talk about, okay, the standing a person needs to have, the idea it's a project manager, etc. But I think the capacity of self-awareness, of identifying and managing your own emotions and identifying and managing the emotion of the other people around the table or not around the table is so important. And I think we have underestimated it, and it would be really interesting actually to do more research around that as well, in how emotional intelligence, for instance, impacts mediation outcomes.
Yeah.
We got sidetracked, right?
Sorry?
We got sidetracked. We're sort of losing our different points.
No, we're good. We have just anticipated one or the other point. Just checking the comments. There is none so far. I hope for Isabel we answered the question. Yeah, actually, now I remember what I wanted to say. It just came back. So maybe to summarize, Isabel, not to summarize, but to have a conclusion on her question is also, so what do you do connected with your point about emotional intelligence, and what do you do if in such a situation you feel strongly affected as a mediator? My answer would be you might not be the right person if it's too hard, too strong for you, emotionally too important, and possibly at some point you're not the right mediator for that situation. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a total valid point, and I think that would be maybe the sort of the solution if nothing else works. I found that what also helps is that you really, again, that really connects to the importance of emotional intelligence. What I did at the time, and again, this is on no level, is this the same scale, right? Of sort of antipathy or difficulties with speaking to someone because of something. So I think that you have to, there's different levels. So clearly atrocities, it's super hard to manage. But I think one way is really to also make this effort and trying to see the person, like even have a separate meeting, for instance, if you can face it, if you have the stamina, to just, as you said, Pascal, find the humanity, because even though people commit these crimes, and this is by no means wanting to justify anything, and what they've done, but there is still a human there. And I think it's the mediator's role to try and find that human there. And otherwise, I think the process cannot really work. But I think, and maybe we can, if you agree, Pascal, we could connect it to one of the other topics we thought is worthwhile to mention, which is like, who do you bring to the table? How is it different on an international level from a private mediation? And I think it opens this question of, do we speak to terrorists, right? I mean, I jumped now a bit, but I think we wanted to about this tool, right? In terms of who are the stakeholders, who's around the table, who are the parties?
It's also it's the same difficult question as the one regarding the atrocities. Before we start this, just another question, but a comment from Helmut. He says, I fully agree, emotional intelligence and ability to self-reflect are key for mediators. Thanks, thanks Helmut for the remark. Yeah, so your question was, do we negotiate with terrorists?
And I think it's, and I think it's just one of the other, but I think it's one of the other, it's the huge difference between a private or classical mediation setting and an international level, right? Because already who are the parties is a totally different question, because you don't necessarily see all the parties that have a stake, or they're not part of the table, because often the big players in the back that are not around, but that have a huge impact on the outcome. I think that adds another layer of complexity. Plus, you have non-state armed groups that are part of the conflict. And then the question is, can we talk to them or can we not talk to them? Pascal, what do you think?
Well, it's really a difficult question. I would say as a principle, I mean, you make peace always with your enemies. You don't make peace with your friends. You make peace with your enemies. And so having said this, I think everybody who can potentially, even if you're not convinced that that group or person or whatsoever will contribute, but everybody who potentially can contribute to peace, to an agreement, should be at the table, I think, as a principle. And then it needs maybe pre-discussion. You might have, I mean, in international processes, you might have years of pre-mediation, no? But I think everybody, because if you miss out actors, they might either be a lost resource because they are not involved somewhere, or they might become a spoiler because they're not involved, they're not attached to it somewhere. So, and I was just thinking when you asked the question about the more local type of mediation, you know, in criminal penal mediation, where you also have, and there you have a police report, you have an author, and you have a victim, you know, a criminal.
Yeah.
Or in restorative justice, which is again, some don't agree that this is a kind of mediation, but let's say at least it's close to it, similar. You do mediation, you do a restorative justice with people who committed atrocities, like again, rape or whatever, you know, physical violence. So yeah, there are a couple of reflections from my side. What are yours?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, because there's no other way, I think, to build peace.
Yeah, so sorry, just the last point, because maybe you can still choose who is at the table. If you have a certain group, you know, even a considered terrorist group, doesn't mean you won't have the whole group at the table. You know, maybe you might have some people of that group that are maybe more, let's say, have a less violent past, or are, I don't know. Yeah, you pick different persons that are maybe more open to negotiation, that don't have blood on their hands, even if as a group they were involved. But you know, this might also be an answer to it.
Yeah, definitely. I also think that it shows that ideally you have other processes in parallel. For instance, you know, a lot of NGOs do that actually quite with a lot of privacy, to work with armed groups because governments can't, and help them sort of reframe their message into a more political one. And so I think if you are able to have that in parallel, and then, as you say, have members nonetheless around the table, that would be ideal. I think the challenge is, though, that the problem is it sends really very mixed messages. It also sends the message to people that if you have the arms, you're powerful and you can come to the table. And I've heard that
That's right.
often. And I've heard that often from you know, parties that have a stake in the conflict, that are concerned by the conflict, and they are not part of the conversation because they are not violent. And it's a problem, of course. And I think that is really, so it's hard to navigate that. But and also because you do shift the power balance in a mediation process as well. And I think in a private setting, and I mean, Pascal, you've done so many also family and neighborhood mediations. The power balance, yes, there is a discrepancy. Often it's never even. Otherwise, people would not necessarily come to you and need help with the conflict. But on an international level, it's sometimes so imbalanced, and that is really hard to navigate as well as a mediator. How do you deal with power imbalances?
I want just to come back with an example for the other point you said. If you have the arms, you are at the table. What signal does this send? And we had in one of our company Community Mediations. They're a group that was in the southern part of Tunisia. Very often the public was demonstrating, and some protesters went to the front line. They were the strongest protesters, like making the most noise and so on. And what happened? That was not, but it was not actually a mediation process, but it was like those who tried to solve the problem. They picked the protesters in the front, the loudest ones, to give them opportunities and benefits to calm them. But the problem was then you got more and more of those, frontline protesters. So you actually motivate people to do that. So in your example,
Right.
you motivate people to take arms because then you have a place at the table,
Yeah, exactly. No, definitely. So that's really, how to manage that. It's really difficult.
Yeah. Power imbalance, always a very difficult question. I mean, you can do it with the setting. If you have, physical meetings, in that you can arrange it with the settings, with the number of people, with who sits where. It's a round table and not a rectangular table, or mix people around the table. Because what you typically have, if you have groups coming to a negotiation table, it reconstructs the real situation, the real life. So you will have both sides facing each other, confrontation. You will have the bosses in the middle and the others not. So, and that's just a very small point, but this is how you can break this dynamics a little bit in the physical meeting. And then, of course, who do you involve? How do you structure? Much more than the physical meeting, the direct setting is the whole process. How do you structure the process? Who is involved? Who's maybe not involved or not at every moment? Maybe if there is a big player, a big power player, who's maybe bringing more noise than something else. Maybe in one meeting you don't have that player at the table. That might be. It also brings me to the idea of strengthening the weaker parties, which is something when I do trainings, people are always very surprised about this because that they said you're neutral. How can you do that? But I think you're not only that you're allowed to, but you have to strengthen the weaker party. And this is not a problem with neutrality, because what we want to have a good result of the mediation. In order to have a good results, you need to have people at the same level. So if you have one weaker party, you are allowed. It doesn't violate your neutrality. You strengthen the weaker party so that you can actually have a mediation result. Otherwise, it's not a mediation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think we've seen this on an international level as well, that in those processes where at the same time there's sort of capacity building of civil society organizations, for instance, to really, work out also what they want to say, because often it's also, so one party has it very clear, this is my position, this is what I want. And for other parties, it's not as clear and it's hard. They have to really think about how do we frame this. And so definitely I would absolutely agree with you that supporting this is important to do. In a smaller setting, I mean, I guess that the mediator can do it. In a bigger setting, it could be another organization, right? So you don't even enter that territory. Are we sort of impacting impartiality? Because at the same time, if you spend more time, and I remember this for myself, sort of really mediating and then speaking to one party and then also feeling, okay, so now I know this side better, but I would need to know the other side just as well and have the same conversation, even though I don't feel I needed to help them resolve the conflict, but just to keep it sort of even. So I think it's just an interesting question. But I think it highlights one more time, I think, the question around power imbalances, how complex and complicated it is for mediation to take place on an international level. And I think when we look to the mediator, we really need other qualifications and experiences than we would need from a family mediator. I mean, we do need some of the same techniques, but I think it is actually a really another level. And maybe we could touch, if you agree, as a last point, Pascal, briefly around the question of professionalization. This is one we talked about as well, and we said, hey, this is interesting because in a lot of countries, mediation is certified, it's very clearly regulated, you have to be accredited, have a certain education, refresh it regularly, take advanced courses, etc. And then in peace mediation, obviously that doesn't exist. And it's rather new that you have, Zurich University is doing a fantastic program, Viadrina University is doing a great program. You have that, of course, increasingly coming, but it's not mandatory. And often we see those who lead the mediation processes have very little concrete educational background around it, right?
No mediation training at all. Yeah, because it's between the posture and the technical skills, and sometimes you need an influential person without any mediation experience or training, but they have a team. So you need the symbol of that person, I would call it, the status of the person, and then all the rest, the technical part, is done with the mediation team or with the mediation support team. Yeah, but more and more trainings are upcoming. You mentioned two of them. I guess there are a couple of other ones, so this is definitely a good thing. Maybe I am not even sure about this, but I think there is no. I don't know if the UN has. I know the UN has these guidelines. I don't know if you saw this UN guideline.
Yeah.
But this is more, I don't know if it's a recommendation or it's a regulation, I guess, for the mediation team, the UN mediation team. It's kind of a regulation or ethical standard. But further than that, there is nothing similar to what you mentioned in the national context.
I think there is, it's just, I don't think it's formalized in a sense that it's always happening at the same time and with the same partners. But I think there is with support. I think organizations like the CIF, the Center for International Peace Operations, sort of the German side of doing work in international peace operations, they do quite a lot of trainings and then support the UN, for instance, and the EU. I worked in Brussels for a while. Supporting the EU on their conflict prevention and mediation work. And the EEAS has really developed very solid mediation education for their diplomats. So I think there's then also the question, and that's again maybe another topic, who do we train? Are we training the right people? Because this is the thing, right? Like I think people also that study, for instance, study the course on peace mediation at the universities, their masters, who are they? Where do they go afterwards? Do they actually really work in peace mediation afterwards, right? So, because it's a crowded field too. So yeah, but that's opening a whole other set of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another point from Isabel. She said, thank you for your thoughtful response to my previous question. Another question, how do we navigate mediation processes at an international level when the process is spoiled by politics? And she has an example. For the example, the Israel-Palestine conflict is complicated by US interests. How might we approach this, or even the idea of strengthening the weaker party when this may be seen unfavorably internationally? Ooh, I think we're going to open up a too big field with this.
Yeah,
maybe a short
this is like the worst. This is, I think, one of the most intrinsically complicated, horrible conflicts that are currently going on that showcases a lot of international powers and how they influence it and absolutely spoil it. And I think I don't know what to answer to that question, to be honest.
Well,
sorry. Can I go in one observation, because I think the challenge here is also that we're breaking international law, and if we do that, we are also, as mediators or as coming into resolving it, I think it's hard to be recognized at all.
Yeah, I would say exactly as you say. So maybe this is not the good answer for the short notice, but we should strengthen the whole, international norms, the the implementation of international rules and so on. That is, of course, a long-term project. It doesn't help for right now immediately. But the other point I thought about is for another process I was involved in southern Morocco, where actually there are different types of power. You might have the money, you might have the skills, you might have different things. But on the other side, you might have, for instance, the media. Because in that example where we were, again, a company community mediation, where my observation, my interpretation is that the company side became more interested in negotiating when those demonstrators went to the media, and they went into European media, even US media. So they had, let's say, media type of power, but they had absolutely no resources, no skills for negotiations, but they had another type of power. So you might have different types of power, and where you can leverage on different levels. But again, this is also at the same time, this was also an escalation at the same time. So it's extremely sensitive on how to deal with these things. Yeah.
And this actually adds the whole question around social media, right? And how media plays a role in putting fire on a conflict or not.
Oh.
Also, which is also really an aspect that we didn't touch upon right now.
We'll have an episode on this. Maybe I think I take the last point from Isabel, and then I guess we are more or less done. So she says, how are the discussed needs or interests noted down? So I'm not sure if she's referring to now our podcast or for a mediation setting. What works best? Is it on a flip chart with sketch notes or words and shortened sentences? Who takes these notes, mediator himself or co-mediator? Okay, so she's referring to mediation. How about taking minutes or notes of a mediation? I would, if I may, I would say this depends extremely on the issues at stake. And to put it simple, if it's more substantial, about, for instance, negotiation about, peace agreement, what are we going to do with security arrangements, what's going to happen with the constitution, whatever, this type of things, it's factual, it's law, you need to write it down somewhere. But if it's more about trust building, more transformative on an emotional level, you don't need any notes. It's about human interaction.
Yeah, although I also feel like once you start writing things down, you sort of start making commitments, right? So they're now talking about, again, a small scale setting.
Right. Good point.
And I think what's also interesting, so I think it really depends. It can be the mediator, but it can also be the parties. And I think what can be really powerful as well is if it's that the party who is not speaking, but listening sort of to the opposing interpretation of things starts to write down the perspective of the other. That can be quite an interesting transformative
as an exercise.
Experience. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, but I mean, that's more, as you said, it's on a different level.
Well, for myself, the only notes I take, whatever the level of mediation is just things I shouldn't forget, like do this or don't forget about that. Or somebody mentions an actor that is not at the table. I write it down not to forget, but that's all. This is not minutes for the meeting. This is just for me.
Yeah.
After mediation, I have 3 or 4 words or sentences on my sheet. That's it. So.
But then, of course, confidentiality comes in as well, and you have to make sure that you are really, whatever you write down, you cannot retain.
Exactly. Yeah, and it should be. I mean, there is some kind of informal part to the mediation. We should keep this. The more you formalize, I think, the more you might disturb the process and the trust.
Yeah, good point.
Good. Some last word, Kathrin. How to round this up?
How to round it up.
I give the challenge to you.
Oh, well, are you expecting me to summarize this?
No.
No, it was like really an interesting conversation. I'm glad I felt for me personally, we touched on quite a number of issues and challenges that I had thought about before. It was really great to hear also some of your very concrete experiences, Pascal. So it was a pleasure to talk to you. And we should say this actually very honestly upfront, that we also do this podcast because we do benefit and we do take pleasure in exchanging
absolutely
our backgrounds and just sort of soundboarding some of our ideas and bouncing them off each other.
It's public intervision, isn't it? Perfect. All right.
You don't have a summary, Pascal?
Summary. Summary. No. What can we say? For me, but that's this part I already mentioned. I think the biggest difference between it's not even 2 levels. I mean, it's probably 5, 6, 10 levels. Micro, then 4 people instead rather than 2, and then maybe small groups, big groups, and then international and so on. I think the more complex, the more, let's say, large scale international it gets, the more you're managing a process rather than doing facilitation in a sense of, asking questions, triggering emotions, and so on. I think that's one for me of the big differences I see, even if you still do this in small settings. I mean, in big settings, but if you talk with people in a group setting, you still do this, but this is less important than it is in a very micro setting. That's for me maybe the main
takeaway.
And deal with many things you didn't expect. But this is in both situations again. A party doesn't show up, or a party shows up with a lawyer, or whatever things happen, or they drop a bomb in the beginning of a meeting. Just to manage unexpected things. I think this is maybe one point we could mention for both. Be flexible.
Yeah.
And trust the process.
That very nice concluding remarks, I find.
Perfect. So we will define another topic for in 2 weeks, and looking forward very much.
Yeah, and thanks to everybody for joining and for the questions. Really appreciated them. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So.